This is the turning point, where desperate hope becomes bold conviction. You have already overcome impossible odds. Thanks to you, good people in this city are starting to feel safe again.
The long-term success of any loot-based title lies in its endgame. In part 1 of my review, I mentioned that The Division 2 is worth playing and buying, even if it's only to finish the story and side missions and to get to max level. Even with a mostly lackluster story and forgettable characters, the gameplay, cover system, the open world's authenticity and detail, and rewards are worth the price of admission, and is still to be considered even if you passed on the first game or grew tired of it quickly. The Division 2 bursts out of the gate with a plethora of content to experience as you level up to max level, and once you hit that level of 30 and reach the end game, well, that's when things change with the Division 2, and I don't mean in a negative way. Once the main campaign is complete and the end game is reached, then it's the real start of the loot grind and trying to build the character and create the loadouts you want to tackle the most difficult content with. It's about perhaps using the different features such as the mods, skills, and the Recalibration Station, which may have mostly been overlooked, but which becomes much more important in the endgame. It's about grinding for gear to have that perfect character build you want to try, and which may not be simply equipping your character with your most powerful gear. Just as Tom Clancy's successful series of novels went on to become blockbuster movies, they also made great video games, which the likes of Rainbow Six, Splinter Cell, and Ghost Recon proved. Now, the Division series can stand alongside them. Whereas the United States and Washington DC has fallen, Ubisoft has done everything they can to make the Division 2 rise, but further tweaks are still needed. Welcome to the endgame, where the real fun begins. So you've made your way through the story campaign and tackled many of the side missions, captured many control points, and taken part in the other world activities. You've been on the hunt to find the best equipment you can find in order to complete the later missions and reach that max level of 30. Now, for anybody who has reached max level and completed the strongholds available, they are then treated to a cutscene showing that Washington DC is undergoing a change, and players will be required to go after this new threat that is trying to seize control of America's capital. As the campaign finishes, we see the new threat known as the Black Tusk march their way into the city and are shown how they have taken over the map that we spent the entirety of the game already trying to control. But whereas this could be seen as a negative, I saw it as a great way to open up players to the end and found it fairly straightforward to understand what I needed to do and how I would go about doing it. So first up, the Division 2 level system is overhauled once you reach that endgame. Gorn is trying to level up past the cap of 30, and instead, a tweaked version of the gear score returns from the first Division game. Instead of completing missions and activities which will slowly push you to level up your rank, the endgame sees each weapon or item get given a gear score, a numerical value indicating the power of that particular item. On a very basic level, the higher the gear score, the better the weapon or the item. But this may vary as well once we start talking about builds and loadouts, which I'll get to later, as having a higher gear score alone may be detrimental to the build you're going for. The gear score goes hand in hand with the difficulty of the endgame and the different world tiers players will make their way through. All players are put into World Tier 1 upon completing the main game and all 3 of the strongholds, and once this is done, then players are asked to choose a specialization. One of 3 special weapons, a sniper rifle, a crossbow, or a grenade launcher, but players are free to swap between them, and as they play, players can unlock further customizations with each weapon through the different skill trees. Now, there are currently 5 world tiers in the game, with Tidal Basin being released as part of the Invasion Battle for DC expansion, which adds even more to the Division 2's endgame. Players will need to progress to a certain gear score in order to move up the world tiers, with a gear score of 275 being needed before players can ascend to World Tier 2, with each subsequent world tier needing the player's gear score to be higher. Players will also need to complete the set of invaded missions in order to gain access to a particular stronghold. These invaded missions are slightly different to what players already completed during the main campaign, but now have a new enemy who have new gadgets and abilities, which sees them be a harder adversary to what players experienced on the road to level 30. Once players reach World Tier 4, then other additions open up, such as getting access to certain bounties, plus opening up a new difficulty setting, whilst World Tier 5 offers even more with gear sets added to the loot pool and a further difficulty increase. Part 1 of my Division 2 review focused around that of a solo player mainly, and what the experience was like playing in this multiplayer focused title. And now that we've hit the end game, where things can get more difficult, there were times during play where I was searching for some help. Having that extra bit of help made the game more enjoyable, which is understandable, as these sorts of games are always better when playing in a group. Trying to matchmake for certain missions and activities did prove problematic though, as often I was left waiting a long time, and once I simply forgot I was trying to matchmake at all in the background as I was playing. It had been running for over an hour with no one joining at all. Other times when trying to matchmake for a stronghold, I found groups relatively quickly, but there were other times where the long waiting times did occur as well. And speaking of the strongholds, I found these more rewarding once playing them in the endgame in a group, with the higher difficulty, change of enemy faction, and the search for increased rewards. I never grew tired of running through these well-designed, dungeon-like activities. As I leveled through each world tier and found more powerful weapons and items to equip my character with, it was always fun to then take these into the stronghold and play it a little differently from the previous time. Even the small changes to the invaded missions to access the strongholds made things feel like I wasn't simply retreading the same content I'd already done before. Even though there aren't enough changes to say, it was a completely new experience, and much of that comes down to the Black Tusk, not the mission design. As mentioned, when you hit the end game, you lose a lot of the control of the map you work towards during the main campaign, but the new enemy differs from those that have come before, as they use different mechanics you need to adjust to, and they use different items as well. Many times I was killed when they deployed their aerial drones, which would seek a player out and explode to knock them out of cover, leaving you open to enemy gunfire. Taking these out became a priority, and if it was done as soon as they were deployed, they would explode over the enemy. Taking care of these drones, plus the enemies, plus also being aware of your surrounding environment, can be quite challenging for the solo player, especially if under-leveled, but it also makes your loadout and what abilities you choose become incredibly important. On a side note, I did prefer how the chem launcher was fired before the update, which saw it behave with holding down the button, aiming and releasing, rather than aiming down sights with our weapon and firing. Moving on from the strongholds and missions, if you still have any outstanding side missions, then definitely do those. We also have the same control points and resource convoys to complete, but now they have been changed and added to. Once you progress to the more difficult world tiers, control points will now have alert levels attached to them. As we take a look at the map, we see red lines going towards control points. When players complete these activities, the control point alert level will increase. Once alert level 4 is reached, the difficulty of that control point goes up significantly, and this is where solo players will definitely struggle unless they have a high gear score and a proper build to take it on. And I found the grenade launcher specialization came in very handy when needing to take down the yellow bar enemies as quickly as possible. The control points will still have resupply officers once the point is captured, and it's important to keep them alive, otherwise the control point will drop in alert levels. Grinding through the endgame as mainly a solo player, I focused quite heavily on the control points and their related activities in order to get better loot, which I would often find in the supply room of a captured control point. The gear you'll be using and the loadout of your character becomes more and more important as you rise through the world tiers. In World Tier 1 and 2, as long as you have some decent gear, then even solo players shouldn't have much of an issue completing most of what they need to do outside of Strongholds, especially if you are over-leveled a little. But as World Tier 3 and 4 comes around, and now World Tier 5 as well, the gear and loadout becomes much more important. With enemies being greater in number and harder to take down, expect soloing to be a challenge. Teaming up with a group, and especially one that had higher level players than you currently are, will see you run through content much quicker, which will see you rank up faster as well. If you will be soloing the majority of the end game, then be prepared for slower progress as you gradually increase your gear level and where activities will take longer to complete. The loot which players can expect to receive is just an extension of what the main game has, and I was already impressed with how the game dished out its loot and the amount that it gave players. But now that the end game has been reached, working on your character build becomes more important. So you'll be chasing certain types of weapons, gear and items to complete the loadout you're wanting to go for. This is when perhaps increasing your gear score may not be the best thing for you to do, as it may negatively impact the build you're going for and also could actually reduce the aspects of your character such as damage output, armor and survivability, or lowering your skill stat, which may impact the items you're using or their effectiveness. And apart from finding new gear out in the wild to increase your gear score, players will also be able to craft weapons from blueprints, and as long as you have enough of the needed crafting materials. Players will unlock the crafting table on their way to level 30, but using it isn't very important until the end game, as you'll only be wasting the resources you've collected by making such low level gear when you'll find better items simply by playing the game's missions. As you enter the end game and rank up world tiers, then it's important to upgrade your crafting table so you can craft items that match the level that your player is at, and this is where resources become very important. You'll need a lot of these in order to constantly upgrade the crafting table in the base of operations, plus you'll then need to craft the weapons you're after. You'll also need money to do so, which will be earned out in the world and by selling off unwanted gear, but also remember that gear can be deconstructed to earn more materials, or they can be donated to settlements in order to complete the various projects on offer. Then we have the Recalibration Station, which is also unlocked during the main campaign when players begin to recruit new personnel to the White House, and again, this becomes much more important during the end game. And it becomes even more important once again when you're trying to go for a specific build for your character, and entails taking an existing weapon and transferring a talent or attribute from another weapon over to it at the expense of money and resources. And this goes for other items as well. There are some limitations to the process, such as only being able to transfer between the same type of item, but delving deeper into recalibrating weapons and gear just adds even more complexity and diversity. Ubisoft has done a great job in launching a proper endgame for the Division 2 at launch, and as at the time of making this review, the Tidal Basin update has been released, which adds to the endgame even further with a new Stronghold and an increased gear score to chase, amongst other additions. I've decided to leave the Dark Zone off this review and will visit it at a later stage once I've put more hours into it and see if it evolves over future updates, as at the moment it isn't in the best possible place it can be, and I'm eager to see what Ubisoft does with this mode moving forward. I mentioned in part 1 of my review that I felt the Division 2 is an excellent purchase, even if it's just to play through the somewhat forgettable campaign and reach max level, as the open world and gameplay is so good to experience. Thankfully, the Division 2 has launched with a proper endgame and with new content already being added, when other looter shooters such as Destiny 2 and Anthem lacked in this department at launch. A steady stream of new activities will need to be added, so players stick with the game, especially when there is now more competition within the genre. The Division 2 is a complete package and is more than worth full price, and hopefully it stands as an example for other similar games to follow over the coming months and years. Deliver feature-rich, complete games. Gamers will support it, and when there is a known roadmap ahead and proper communication between developers and players about the game's future and issues, then those gamers will continue supporting it for a long time to come.